More than 600 pages of messages appear to show the Buffalo supermarket shooting suspect's months-long plan to carry out the attack, according to CBS News. The messages, which are thought to have been written on the social media platform Discord, show his unfolding plan to, quote, kill as many black people as he could. The messages began in November and contain racist and anti-Semitic words and language. Now, of the 13 people killed or wounded, 11 were black.
President Joe Biden on Tuesday called white supremacy a poison in America and called on Americans to reject the racist white replacement theory believed to have inspired the gunman behind the Buffalo shooting. The president said he condemns those who spread the lie for power and political gain and for profit. Let's watch some of that.
So to the families, from your pain, may we find purpose to live life worthy of the loved ones you lost.
Editor-in-chief at the Real News Network, Max Alvarez, and Newsweek contributor Denise Long join us to discuss. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
Thanks, guys.
All right, let's start with you, Denise. You know, I was watching some of the coverage of Joe Biden's remarks, and one thing that was interesting to me was the gap between the really explicit racism of the manifesto, his, description of him attempting purposefully to seek out a black neighborhood and kill black people because he believes in white supremacy. He self-describes as a white supremacist. And then the language in the news, which kind of, used a lot of alleged white supremacist, alleged hate crime. Is this white supremacy still? It was hanging in the wings. And I'm not sure what a person has to do to get rid of some of those caveats. What have you made of some of this coverage?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And so I don't know if that's supposed to be some kind of litigation, preventing litigation from the person who is accused. That's the only reason that I can think of. But would it be okay to say he is a self-described white supremacist? Would that be an accurate portrayal of this particular person and what they did? And there are many things that are happening, many ways media is languaging this thing about him. I have also heard that people are calling it rambling and illogical and nonsensical. And while people who read the manifesto may not come to the conclusion that they would seek violence, given the data that clearly made this man uncomfortable, he clearly did. And it made perfect sense to me what he was saying. And let's also remember that he was 100% successful in what he aimed to do. It made sense. It worked for him. And the only thing that didn't work was him being able to go on after murdering many people in the grocery store to also murder people in the community.
I mean, I guess it depends if you think that, by default, someone who goes and murders a bunch of people at a supermarket, that's a crazy thing to do. So regardless of what the underlying ideology is, and he's someone who has clearly careened from one extremist ideology to another in the way that many of these kinds of shooters have sought out more extreme things in order to, kind of have some sort of meaning or a part of attachment to some group. What do you make of all this, Max?
I mean, human beings are complex, right? I mean, we are a mixture of, homegrown thoughts and feelings and prejudices, and those interact with the world that we're a part of, right? And so as much as, a person's personal psychological condition is a factor here, the rest that I think we're all talking about is a factor as well. The kinds of influences that shape how you think, how you feel, the kinds of downwardly mobile social economic pressures, right, that continue to encourage people to think like this and to look for scapegoats for not being able to live the life that they feel they were promised or live up to the America they believe they were promised. I mean, it's complex, but I think, Bree and Denise are right. You don't have to read this whole manifesto, but if you read some of it, it's not, chicken scratch scrawled in blood on a wall. Like, it is a very kind of thought out, screed that identifies very clearly who this person thinks is the collective enemy, what the quote unquote solution is. And, that's exceedingly terrifying, which is ultimately, the goal of this action. And so I know we're going to and talk more about this, but the one thing I kind of wanted to say, right, is that, like Denise said, the goal was achieved. This was an act of terrorism, and people are terrified, and people have been terrified. And I just wanted to express my deepest condolences and solidarity with everyone in Buffalo and beyond who is feeling terrorized right now, because we recognize that, right? We can acknowledge it in each other's eyes when we pass each other on the street. I remember Black colleagues and brown colleagues just looking at me and I'm looking back at them after 2019, the El Paso shooting, where another gunman walked into a Walmart, killed 23 people, targeting mainly Latinos. But Patrick Crucius was also citing the Great Replacement Theory. He also cited the Christchurch mosque shooting in New Zealand as a sort of inspiration for what he was doing. So whether it's a Walmart in El Paso, a Tops supermarket in Buffalo, or Dylan Roof shooting up the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, what I want to emphasize is that on top of being intellectually kind of sound, these people are f***ing cowards. They attack us in supermarkets. They attack us in our places of worship. They are weak, and they take that weakness out on people who have nothing to do with the kind of problems that they're talking about. And that should tell you something about how poisonous this really is. If you can look at someone going to pick up a birthday cake for his son's wedding, his son's birthday in Buffalo, and see them as somehow the enemy of all the social ills that we're living with, what kind of ideology is that? And anyone who supports that is also a coward.
Yeah, that's really well said, Max. And I think in some ways, the conversation about particular conservative media figures who have talked about the Great Replacement Theory has distracted from the prevalence of the Great Replacement Theory generally in the public. And the idea that it is there regardless of whether or not someone like Tucker Carlson talks about it on his show, that Tucker is somebody who looks at the landscape of what's being spoken about in the media and pulls what is popular. He is not originating a lot of these things. And that even if it were, a result of someone being crazy, obviously most people who are mentally ill don't kill anybody. We still have to have a conversation about why these acts of violence are being expressed in these particularized ways and what that says broadly about what's going on in society. And I think your point about why people who experience very real stressors and harms and economic precarity feel like the answer is shooting people in a supermarket instead of looking at any number of other factors, especially in a city like Buffalo, which is so economically depressed and segregated, as many people have pointed out. Speaking of Buffalo as a municipality, India Walton, who ran for mayor of Buffalo, shared this harrowing clip of people calling for help during the terrifying attack.
What you saw this afternoon?
I didn't really see much at all. I just heard the gunshots and just dropped down to the ground and just waited for him to stop. And he just wouldn't stop. So I tried to call 911 and I was whispering because I could hear him close by. And when I whispered on the phone to 911, the dispatcher would start yelling at me saying, "Why are you whispering? You don't have to whisper." And I'm trying to tell her, like, "Ma'am, he's in the store. He's shooting as an active shooter. I'm scared for my life." And she said something crazy to me, and then she hung up in my face. And I had to call my boyfriend and tell him to call 911.
Well, that is certainly unfortunate, Letitia.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so here we have, obviously, there was heroism displayed in the store, the security guard who ultimately tried to take down the shooter and was killed. All of the thoughts and prayers to his family and the world. But we also have this evidence, again, that there have been some failures from law enforcement as people in the store were trying to call for help and being told, basically, that they needed to just talk louder as there was an active shooter in their midst. Denise, what do you make of that recording?
I am astounded, even though it's not the first such failure in 911 that I have heard. I think it lends toward a serious, and I do mean serious, conversation and course correction about the institutions that are responsible for what happened in Buffalo and in many other places, because this person is not the first one to do this. We need to talk about the absolute failure of Alejandro Mayorkas and Homeland Security. We need to talk about the failure of government officials who have leaned into this idea about critical race theory and arguing the need to implement anti-racism and teach our children, explicitly teach our children, to not be racist. We need to talk about the ways that Joe Biden himself in his 50 years in public service has befriended racists and legitimized their existence because they didn't call him boy, right? There are ways that I'm going to find nice words for this. There need to be some serious accountability. Some people need to lose their jobs. Some institutional policies, recruitment, retention strategies need to be adjusted post haste. This 911 center and whatever is happening there, as well as around the country, needs to be among them.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I hate this trend of the political figure. Governor Kathy Hochul was talking about how this is all social media's fault. Well, this is a law enforcement failure. This guy was known to law enforcement, as is often the case, was the case with the Parkland shooter, where there was every failure. The FBI knew about that guy. They didn't do anything. They didn't do the right thing. Don't blame other people. And so listening to that 911 call, just really, really sickening. The callousness, the indifference of the people who are paid, who are by the taxpayers to protect us, to perform emergency service. Just that, it's really sickening. What's your reaction, Max?
Basically that, it is incredibly sickening. And, what's even more sickening, or not more sickening, equally sickening, right, is that I fear we're going to do what we always do. We're going to see this as somehow, like a failure that can be fixed by throwing more money at the damn police. Mm-hmm. They got plenty of police. We saw the Buffalo police in full force. Remember when the George Floyd protests were happening? They pushed over that poor old guy whose head split open. We know they got police, right? And so it makes me think of the systematized callousness that is the policing system in this country, and how that connects to the broader kind of historical forces that have created this horrific situation that we're all living in. I look around me. I live in Baltimore, right? Baltimore is a city that spends more on police per capita than any city in the world. And this kind of crap happens every single day. It is not a bug. It is a feature of the system. This is a town that has been economically and policy-wise eviscerated for decades. It is losing population. There are whole segments of the population, poor, predominantly black, that are policed to all hell. And you have police officers on record and showing repeatedly by their actions that they look at the black citizens of this town like the shooter in Buffalo looks at them, as invaders, as animals, as mongrels, to be controlled, to be funneled in to a prison industrial complex that takes them out of society. This is something that we live with every day, and it is something that is, multiple people are responsible for this, to your point, Robbie. And that includes, Joe Biden and the Democrats. That includes the Republicans, not just them. But I wanted to kind of end on that point, because remember when Joe Biden, to Denise's point, he's multiple times kind of longingly talked about the days when you could sit down and have lunch with segregationist legislators and still have that sort of civility. What was happening while y'all were sitting at that table having lunch? People were being lynched at the same time that you were trying to coddle the most reactionary elements in your colleagues and saying, we can sit down, we can compromise here, and people are getting shot up. Stop compromising with this. Stamp it out. Force everyone in elected office to actually take a stand stand against this, and because this is not going to stop. And Biden, one thing Biden said that was right is that this is a poison, and that poison runs deep in the veins of America. I grew up with proto versions of this, hearing from right-wing talk radio that what the Democrats wanted to do was open the borders, flood the country with illegal immigrants who were going to have anchor babies, who were going to then build an indomitable voting bloc for the Democratic Party. Like, that is batshit stuff, but it was very much mainstreamed, and there are a lot of current legislators who believe that. So this isn't going to go away just by taking Trump off Twitter, by ramping up, censorship on social media. It's not going to help by throwing money at the police. That poison runs deep. And to Denise's point, we need to take a long, hard look at where it comes from and actually be serious about ridding ourselves of it. Otherwise, this terror will persist.
Yeah. So, Denise, we want to give you the last word. I do think, now I agree the theory is insane. It's not even turning out to be true necessarily that bringing in immigrants is some massive coup for the Democratic Party, because immigrants are not a unitary voting bloc. Actually, many immigrants are religious, and plenty of them like Trump. Trump has done well with specific immigrant groups. So it doesn't make sense. There was a lot of, I think, almost gloating or gleeful sort of in the Obama era about how we're going to have more immigration and the Democratic Party is going to be unstoppable now. That gave some rise to this fear that, again, I don't think is true. It has not turned out that way at all. But we'll give you the last word, Denise.
So there are some elements of truth to this that we need to acknowledge as well. The reality is that the white population globally has been increasing for generations, right? The white population in the United States has been increasing. More white people are dying than are decreasing. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Decreasing. More white folks are dying than are being born. We do have an immigration control issue in the United States of America. Democrats and Republicans are responsible for not enforcing immigration laws. All of that said does not mean you need to go out and kill people while they are grocery shopping or doing whatever, right? So there are ways
people
that we
who've been
need
here
to
as long as white people. He's shooting black people who've been in this country as long as white people.
Or longer, including Ruth Whitfield, who is a descendant of slaves, an 86-year-old woman, descendants of slaves, stopped by the grocery store after visiting her husband. So there are some things that policymakers need to do, including immigration control. This is not a gun control issue. This is a white supremacy issue, right, that needs to be addressed. This is an anti-Black racism issue that, as Max says, runs through America. So let's keep the topic on what it needs to be focused on. And there are policy issues that need to be played out. And the way that we talk about them can create anxiety in people who have a warrior mentality and may act on what they hear in a way that causes damage to the rest of us.
Max and Denise, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this really difficult and obviously horrifying subject. Thanks so much.
Thank you for the time.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.